Welcome. Make Yourself Useful is a collective working to end apathy and malaise within white circles. We aim to move people towards accountability, connection, and mindful action for racial justice. Thank you to ACRE for collaborating on this series. ACRE is an artist-led, community-focused artist residency and exhibitions program based in Chicago, Illinois, and Steuben, Wisconsin. And our topic tonight is Armchair Activism versus Accomplice work. And if we were all together in a room, we could do a show of hands for how many of us got trapped in the black square last week. So we liked this meme about that. We can laugh at ourselves, it's okay. But let's use this workshop and all of the tools available to us in the interwebs and our networks and beyond to move beyond the black square. So this session is going to focus on media literacy and social justice and abolition. We will also talk about donating money to Black-led organizations and getting your networks donating too. We wanted to start with this poem by Danez Smith as a way to kind of center and ground ourselves in the work that we're about to do together. And I will read it out loud. Please read along. Little prayer. Let ruin end here. Let him find honey where there was once a slaughter. Let him enter the lion's cage and find a field of lilacs. Let this be the healing, and if not, let it be.
Like Ruby said, we just want to start with a few premises. This Toni Morrison quote, if you can only be tall because somebody is on their knees and you have a very serious problem. My feeling is that white people have a very, very serious problem and they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it. So just, kind of grounding this conversation today in, these ideas. White supremacy is a white problem. It's up to white people and people with white privilege to dismantle white supremacy. We live in a white supremacist society. There's no absolution, no, but I'm not a racist. We're all complicit, and there's always work to do. In any given struggle for justice, we follow the leadership of those most affected. So, in this movement for Black Lives, we're following Black leadership with the understanding that it is not monolithic. I'll just read through these. It means calling for the abolition of police and prisons, looking to Black organizers for direction at protests and vigils, and not going rogue at protests. Remember, we're not the ones being targeted by cops by and large. Looking to Black organizers and cultural workers across all forms of media, boosting Black voices and positions. So, going back to the black square situation on social media, educating ourselves and other white people with white privilege. So reading, interrupting racism in our families, communities, workplaces, using our proximity to whiteness to dismantle it, reallocating and redistributing resources to Black organizations and people, paying Black people for their intellectual labor and not asking them for their emotional labor. So you've maybe seen a lot of people messaging their Black friends and acquaintances this week, asking to be educated. That is not what we want to be doing. That's asking people to be doing a lot of work that it's not their job to do. It's our jobs to educate ourselves. So.
And I'm going to start by just sharing a clip of this video, which gives a great explanation. This is Brittany Packnett Cunningham from Pod Save the People, also co-founder of Campaign Zero. Oh, no. Okay.
One is see becoming an ally as a first step. See your aspiration as becoming an accomplice and then a co-conspirator. Here's what I mean by that. An ally shows up when it is convenient. An accomplice shows up when there is a risk. A co-conspirator decides to go into the risk proactively because they help create the money in the first place. There have to be levels to this thing if you are going to participate for a lifetime. So my first piece of advice is to be cool with being an ally, but be committed to becoming a co-conspirator. The second is to understand fundamentally what your work is. There is, I'm trying to remember the setting and I can't remember, but someone said if you are trying to help out on an issue that you don't know about, listen for a year before you go and engage. And then when you do go and engage, ask permission from the community that is most affected by that problem to be engaged. Often we come with an unintentional savior complex that says, I've got the education, I've got the money, I've got the background, I've got the professional experience, so of course you want my help. Of course I know better than you. Of course I can set the agenda and then expect you to follow it. That is a surefire recipe for disaster. It's a surefire recipe to actually enact more harm than you do good, because you are using your privilege to silence the very people who should be leading.
Okay, so that's just a clip, but a great illustration of how to start thinking about your role as a white person or a person with white privilege. And these on the right-hand side, these definitions are her definitions. I won't read through them, but maybe Carrie already said this, but we are going to be sharing this PowerPoint presentation, or Google slide presentation on our website. And so everybody who is interested will have the opportunity to go back through with like a fine-tooth comb if you want to. And we have a lot of resources as well in the notes section of this presentation. And then along with that, we're going to be sharing another toolkit at the end of the night with even more sources. So moving on, the words ally and accomplice and co-conspirator they're all over the internet. And just want to remember that like organizing language is never going to be monolithic. And it's best to try not to get hung up on that, but to just like study what you see. We've seen some really excellent writing and posts about how to be an effective ally. We've also seen like a huge takedown of the concept of ally in the next, or in the 3 slides from now, we have like an example from Indigenous Action Media where they talk about like the ally industrial complex. So there's all different ways of thinking about this. And we just want to share these distinctions because there is no right, quote unquote, right language. It's just really important to understand these different definitions, and of which there are many, as a way of honing our politics and skills as effective actors in the movement for racial justice. So, for example, this slide that's up right now, these are some screenshots from someone's Instagram account. They made infographics out of a piece of writing made by a friend of theirs. This is like, sorry for the long-windedness, but the friend wants to be anonymous. So the person who wrote these wants to be anonymous, but we thought that they were so like rich and interesting and wanted to share them. And so I just wanted to emphasize, like in slide 1, they write, in addition to thinking that people need to straight up reject the nonprofit language of white allyship, I am not a fan of the word, quote, accomplice language either. I think both don't get at what's crucial, ideological alignment. Me and Black comrades are ideologically aligned. We are anarchists, communists, anti-capitalists, anti-racists against liberal anti-racism and its deployment of identity politics weaponized against radicals in general. We are not nonviolent, we are comrades. And then it continues, and they make the point, I cannot sit down and shut up and also stand up and fight back. And I really encourage everybody to read these in full. We wanted to emphasize these ideas because they really speak to the importance of studying and clarifying your own politics and position, as opposed to kind of coming at your identification or positioning from a place of fear or perfectionism. So how can you create your own politic? How can you ground in your politics as a way to do the work? And then this last piece is from Accomplices Not Allies, Abolishing the Ally Industrial Complex, which is a zine created by Indigenous Action Media. This cartoon on the left is not from the zine, but I just thought it was relevant. It's a what not to do cartoon. And I'll just read out a couple of these. Accomplices, and this is written with Indigenous liberation at the center, but we feel that it's also applicable to the movement for Black lives. So, accomplices listen with respect for the range of cultural practices and dynamics that exist within various Indigenous communities. Accomplices are realized through mutual consent and build trust. They don't just have our backs, they are at our side, or in their own spaces, confronting and unsettling colonialism. As accomplices, we are compelled to become accountable and responsible to each other. That is the nature of trust. And then these are some additional actions that we wanted to just highlight right now briefly, but all of these, everything on this list is going to be covered more explicitly in our 4 upcoming workshops. So show up at protests, learn about who's behind them beforehand, go where you feel aligned and useful, and follow organizer cues when you're there. Keep making phone calls and writing to your elected officials. Don't forget the massive role of electoral politics, and we like to think of electoral politics as harm reduction. Participate. Learn about the specificities of anti-Blackness within the context of racism and white supremacy. Educate yourself on abolition, restorative justice, and not calling the cops. Challenge your own fragility and remember it's okay to make mistakes. Be in community and share the work. Undoing white supremacy is not healthy or sustainable when undertaken alone. Find an accountability buddy and be vulnerable together. Better yet, find a crew. And then these are some questions to ask yourself as well as ask others and ask books on the road to action. What do I believe in and why? What motivates me? What is whiteness? What is white supremacy? How has whiteness and white supremacy shaped and benefited me? How has it hurt me? How am I using my body, my resources, my connections to resources? How am I interrupting racism every single time? How am I accountable to those most impacted? How can I sustain my anti-racist work beyond the trending media cycle? Am I asking for emotional labor from friends, family, and colleagues of color, or sitting back while they do the work? For example, explaining the concept of microaggressions to white people who have caused harm, when that's work that I could be doing instead? And how am I staying grounded so that I don't get overwhelmed and burn out and then drop out? Some things to remember. This is a quote from Mariam Kaba, who used to live in Chicago, now is based in New York. She's an incredible abolitionist, organizer, educator. We've pasted links to a lot of her work in the presentation, and there are also some in the toolkit. Really encourage her, really encourage you to check out her work as like a way of understanding foundationals when it comes to police and prison abolition. And she says, hope is a discipline. And then we also wanted to add love is a verb, and the work is never done. And it took decades of Black and brown organizing to see the Minneapolis City Council pledge to dismantle the police. White supremacy will not be over in our lifetime, even if we have the privilege to forget about its violence when it's no longer trending. And this is a quote from Sonia Gupta. Unlearning white supremacy isn't Instagrammable. It's deeply personal, existential, and difficult work. It often feels horrible. It will make you cry. You might become depressed. It can be very lonely and isolating. It will shatter your ego and your belief system. Do it anyway. And again, just want to emphasize here the importance of being in community when it comes to doing this work, even if it's a community of two. Really, whatever you can do, don't go it alone. And this is the money section of this presentation. And so I wanted to start out with some screenshots from Mandy Harris Williams. Her account on Instagram is Ideal Black Female. Highly recommend this account. And the question that this proposes tonight in our work is, how can we center love as opposed to Black death spectacle as a motivation for giving money away? So just want everyone to like kind of hold that.
So yeah, so some best practices when donating money. Budget and make it sustainable year-round. So we're seeing a lot of nonprofits like cap out their donations right now. Most of them allow you to become like monthly sustainers. So, you know, if you can afford to give like $5 or $10 a month, we recommend 5 to 10% of your income or more if you can afford it. Look for Black-led organizations, small local organizations that are doing the work in your communities versus nationally. Donate not only to on-the-ground organizers, but also compensate and cite cultural workers, activists, public thinkers, non-affiliated academics, etc. And some other ideas for, you know, making your money go further. You know, propose an employer match if your job has it. A lot of people fundraise on social media, like for their birthday. I know Facebook allows you to do that. Organize online and in-person fundraisers, and Make Yourself Useful has had a lot of success with that in the past. Individual Ask with Family Members, which can kind of double as a way to talk to your family members about racism, which we're also going to cover more in an upcoming session. And I think the next slide, Kate, or should I just do my screen?
I got the next slide.
Okay. And best politics, the best way to kind of think about this money is not as charity, but as investment in our communities, that it's our obligation as people with white privilege to redistribute resources, many of which don't belong to us in the first place, and to think of it as restorative, not as reparations. Reparations is something that can only be acted, you know, systemically by the government. A great example is like thinking about donating to people's medical or healthcare GoFundMes, which is like great and valuable, but like doesn't eclipse like having Medicare for all, for instance. I'm going to talk a little bit about media literacy and social media literacy. Just want to sort of start by saying that no news is truly objective or neutral. That sort of framing really upholds white supremacy and this sort of idea that there's like one neutral way to look at like a situation, meaning the one neutral way is like the white way. This is a quote from the Freelance Collective Study Hall that was sent in an email last week, just sort of talking about objectivity in the wake of the protests and the things that have been going on the past few weeks that I really liked. I won't read the whole thing, but just want to point out that every story written is made up of a lot of choices about how to frame facts, who to talk to, what angle to take, that all journalism involves choosing sides. They go on to say, we understand if this makes you uncomfortable, we'd also ask you to interrogate why it makes you uncomfortable and who you're helping if you remain objective. So just important to keep these things in mind, always be skeptical of the news that we're consuming, even if it's someone trustworthy or someone radical, particularly in times like these when people's safety and freedoms are on the line. Here's an example of framing the way the same situations can be framed. Here's two headlines from the Tribune from last week that kind of focus on the violence of the protests. The Tribune is a conservative newspaper in Chicago, so this is not surprising. And then here are two headlines from The Tribe, which is a Black-owned and Black-run news publication. So really vastly different framing of the same story. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Some more examples to kind of illustrate how news is not objective. In the past week, 2 Black journalists who work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette were barred from covering the protests because they were seen as biased for being Black. There was also an example in Chicago last week when Mayor Lightfoot said at a press conference that from what she's heard, people in neighborhoods want more police, not less. There was no one else quoted in the story. There were no organizers quoted. There was no one from an actual neighborhood quoted. There was like very little context in this NBC Chicago story. That's what this quote is from. So, just sort of thinking through these things, who's quoted, why might they be quoted, what does this publication have to benefit from sort of like upholding these authority figures? And that sort of relates to this like concept of like showing both sides, which, I think is really false. A great example that I think a lot of people saw, especially people who are like really plugged into the media world, was this horrific op-ed written by Tom Cotton, who's senator, in the New York Times. It was called "Send in the Military," and it was basically calling for the government to like employ the Insurrection Act and use violence against protesters because people are so out of control. And it had all these false assertions about like Antifa and all these sorts of things. And there was a huge uproar about it because, it was basically like inciting violence and putting Black people in danger, Black journalists who work at the New York Times. So the editor of that section ended up getting fired. They hadn't even read it, supposedly. So, there's sort of like a reason that especially legacy news organizations might want to, they say that they want to sort of run these sorts of news stories because they're, one, they're clickbait, of course, but 2, that they sort of like allow us to better posit our own politics and why we might be in opposition to things or expand our thinking. But by the way, this quote here is part of the disclaimer now that's on the New York Times website. It's not anything that I wrote. But when we're publishing things like this that are basically calling on the military to hurt protesters, we also have to weigh that people's physical reality is in danger. So, what's the cost benefit analysis there? Are news organizations actually thinking about this? And similarly, thinking about language that we see or hear in the news, a lot of it is like sort of shorthand that really is geared towards white people. Unarmed Black Man is a really good example. The journalist Wesley Lowery wrote on Twitter this week that news organizations should largely abandon this shorthand of unarmed victims because it suggests that whether or not someone is armed or unarmed, it should gauge whether the incident that we're debating is acceptable. And then I sort of came up on this whole article about the term "on pointer" by Kelly McBride. And she sort of did like a news analysis of NPR. In the last year, NPR has used the phrase "unarmed Black man" 82 times, and they've never used the term "unarmed white man" in that time frame. And just sort of, it's using that term sort of signals to the reader that the first thing they need to know is like, was this person armed? Because that sort of tells you whether the violence is justified. Whereas like, this violence is never justified. And it also presupposes that the Black person at question was violent. So, the whole, supposition of it is deeply rooted in racism. Also very relevant to what's going on right now are these like concepts of peaceful protests or looting and rioting versus protest or direct action. I think, again, this is like, whether people are using these terms is, again, sets up like a false dichotomy of protests, whether like there's good ways to protest and bad ways, or there's real protesters and then there's agitators. I think, protests exist on a spectrum. So it's really, it's unhelpful to think of it that way. It also like makes the reader think that good behavior protests keep protesters safe, which we know is not true. I mean, the police are attacking people who haven't done anything wrong. as we've been seeing all over the news. So there's a lot of other examples in this slide. I won't read them all, but I really like this quote I saw on Instagram this week from Youth Justice LA. Labeling a protest against police terrorism as peaceful erases the power dynamic between a militarized force and unarmed residents of color, and that not peaceful actions are justified responses to police violence. So I thought those are also really good things to keep in mind. So that sort of relates to talking about the white supremacist or police agitator at protests, which I'll just sort of briefly touch on. I think it's useful to be cognizant of these things, especially in this time, because there have been known white supremacists and or undercover cops and or those people are one and the same who come to protests, who surveil people, and who commit violence. So we saw in Chicago last week in Bridgeport, there were like groups of white people yielding household weapons, terrorizing residents while the police watched and didn't do anything. There were members of the Proud Boys, which is a white supremacist group, spotted at a protest in Uptown. There's been a Chicago police officer who's been outed as being affiliated with Proud Boys. And Jacobin and Mother Jones both had long articles this week on all sorts of documentation of police committing violence and property destruction at protests this week. There's like video of cops like smashing people's tires and smashing car windows. And so, you know, when you hear reports of violence at protests, just, you know, think of it in this large picture of like, we don't know who's committing the violence. And just to kind of reiterate what Ruby said, you know, if you are at a protest, it's best to always follow the lead of the organizers of that protest and just think of that, you know, whoever is committing property destruction, people of color will bear the brunt of those consequences. And similarly on that vein, always best to vet protest information, location, who's organizing it before you go, because white supremacists do sometimes spread false protest information. So hopefully I'm not going too fast for anybody. So I just want to talk a little bit about fake solidarity. This segues a little bit into social media literacy as well. That everyone, especially now these days, should be very wary of cops, politicians, other state agents, and also businesses giving sort of like these false signs of solidarity or these standing solidarity messages, whatever that means. A great example is this Black Lives Matter mural that went up in the street in DC this week. It was directed by DC's Mayor Bowser. And I saw a lot of people sharing this on social media, but Black Lives Matter DC has denounced it as performative street art. They had a whole public statement to the mayor about it. I'll just read this one sentence. To chip away at the investments in communities that actually make us safer while proposing a $45 million increase in funding for the Metropolitan Police Department budget a few weeks ago is not making Black Lives Matter. So basically they're calling her out for sort of this empty gesture where she's not really making any efforts to defund the police or improve the lives of Black members of her community. Here's another horrific one from this week. Amy Klobuchar at George Floyd's memorial. This is a quote from the LA Times, that 30 people died after encounters with police when Klobuchar was, I forget her exact title. I think she was, I forget, but basically she was like state's attorney or something like that. So she had purview over disciplining cops, basically. So during that time period, this was before she was senator, 30 people died in encounters with the police. That included an incident with Officer Chauvin, who was involved with 5 other officers in the fatal shooting in 2016 of Wayne Reyes, who allegedly pulled a shotgun on the officers after stabbing. So, she basically was the prosecutor, in a former life, and here she is at George Floyd's memorial. I mean, with her mask down, so you can get the good photo op. Another example we've seen a lot this past week is officers taking a knee at protests. There was video of Buffalo police officers doing it, earlier in the day, that they later shoved an elderly man onto the ground and cracked his head open. As some activists have pointed out, it also recalls the way George Floyd was murdered. So that's really problematic. I think it's important to remember that this movement is not about the behavior of individual police officers, that police departments are trained to uphold systemic racism. So, there may be some cops who feel regret or think, these actions are bullshit, but, it's not about individual police officers. It's like, one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. So just important to keep that in mind. Similarly, we've seen that a lot from businesses, nonprofits, institutional statements, just asking, just be wary of this, and demand more of all these places, particularly those who are well-heeled. They should really all be acting. They should all be donating money. They should all be making concrete commitments, like the Walker Art Center cut ties with their police department this week. Here's another example on the next slide that the artist Glenn Ligon posted on his Instagram this week, that the Met, which is like one of the richest museums, sent this like email out about how they're standing in solidarity, and they included artwork from Glenn, and they didn't make any commitments at all. They didn't donate any money. They famously had 2 Black curators in their entire history. So, just like the time for words is like over. So just be cognizant of these things. Here are some recommendations for trustworthy news. This is just like a really small sampling. We'll have more in our resource guide. And just to point out that Black-led or Black-owned news organizations are going to have like vastly different takes on stories that affect Black people or their own communities. So, definitely good to expand your news diet in that sense. So before you post or repost anything, I think, it's always important to sort of like take a beat and think about why you're doing it. Do you want to appear a certain way, i.e. do you want to look anti-racist? So is your post more performative or than substantive? Who is your audience? If your audience is mostly white, you might have a real opportunity for education, or other ways to reach people. So really just be mindful of that. Does the post lead to a tangible positive outcome? So are you sharing crucial information?
Carrie? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. Something happened with your microphone. Do you mind adjusting a little bit? It's a little fuzzy.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Oh, that's great. Yes. Thank you.
So are you sharing crucial info, links to donate, ways to contact like an elected official? Thinking about like the Blackout Square, like we mentioned earlier, if you participated in that, what was your intention? It came on a day when a lot of protesters and activists were trying to share information, really crucial information with people's safety, like where cops were, or, where resources were, especially with all these like curfews being enacted. It was also an election day in several states. So it was a really bad time to be like clogging social media with, a Black square that didn't have any information on it. So just kind of thinking more about these things, it's easy to kind of get caught up in like a viral moment. So again, just slowing down, thinking about the source, also thinking about what sort of images or language you want to reproduce in the world. I think it's important personally to not share images of videos of Black murder or death. There was a lot of outcry over that in Chicago when Laquan McDonald, when his murder video was released, a lot of people were sharing it. It's really traumatizing for family and for people who actually know that person. It's also really not our place to kind of share that information. No one should need to witness that sort of thing to like know that violence is wrong and that these murders are like horrific. So another thing to think about is that the algorithms, social media algorithms, you know, are famously opaque, but they have been known to stifle Black and Brown accounts and also radical politics. You may have seen last week, or I guess it was 2 weeks ago at this point, TikTok banned Black Lives Matter and the BLM hashtag. So, you know, white voices and white profiles are likely to get more views on social media. So, you know, one way to kind of combat that is to amplify Black and Brown voices, Black-led organizations. Again, think about who follows you and what opportunity you might have to reach people beyond the usual echo chamber. So one other example other than the Black Lives Square that happened recently is that I saw a lot of people sharing the 8 Can't Wait campaign. This is the graphic that goes along with it. It's basically 8 police reform, you know, propositions. It was released by Campaign Zero, and basically, you know, they wrote this report, like sort of an academic report, showing that police departments who used more of these tactics had fewer incidents of violence. That was really quickly debunked by a lot of people on the internet. E-Viewing, who is a professor at University of Chicago, had some pretty great points, as did this other academic, Emma Glennon. I encourage everyone to go and read both of these threads because they're really long, and I'm not going to reiterate all their points. But just a couple of them I will point out. You know, basically these are just more reforms, and many cities already have a lot of these policies and already have a lot of officer malfeasance. For example, Seattle has had this no tear gassing policy, and everyone has been seeing this photo from yesterday or 2 days ago of Seattle tear gassing a huge crowd of people. We're talking about banning chokeholds when the New York Police Department banned them in 1993, and that's what killed Eric Garner. So, you know, the time for police reform is over. This is not what activists on the ground, this is not what Black Lives Matter is calling for. The report that they put out also only relied on 6 months of data and posited that correlation equals causation, so, which, like most, you know, any scientist knows is like not, you know, rigorous or empirical work. So, you know, instead, what Black Lives Matter activists are calling for is abolition. This graphic by Critical Resistance is actually much more informative. It goes through all these potential reforms that a lot of people call for and endorse, and whether those things actually give more funding to police and make communities safer versus the abolitionist tactics on the bottom. So again, we'll link to this. I definitely encourage everyone to read it. It's a really helpful, quick breakdown. Yeah, cool. So then moving on a little bit to documentation at protests. There's a lot of safety considerations to kind of keep in mind. There's one, which is like filming an incident of police brutality, which is sort of separate, although may have some things in common with filming at a protest. Witness.org has a really good guide for filming police brutality, which we'll link to it in the slides. But it's definitely important to know your rights before you turn your camera on. Laws vary state by state, and to develop a safety plan for you know, contact information, legal aid, what you'll do with your camera if you have to escape. And then at a protest, some specific things to consider. A lot of people recommend leaving your smartphone at home, bringing a flip phone if you need one, or if you do bring your smartphone, to turn off location services and or turn on airplane mode, and to use encrypted messaging apps like Signal, and also to disable facial recognition and use an actual password instead, because that's protected by your Fifth Amendment. Police cannot force you to open your phone in that way, unlike for facial recognition. It's also important to think about protecting the identities of other protesters by not taking pictures of them or filming them, or if you do, by blurring their faces. Try not to capture identifying information like tattoos. A lot of people say film cops, not the protesters, especially if they're showing their names and badge numbers. Cops do use facial recognition and license plate scanners to surveil activists. There have been many reports on like the mysterious deaths of several protesters from Ferguson, so there is a very real safety concern there. Another tip is to, if you are going to post a photo, not to post the original photo, but to instead take a screenshot of it, which eliminates its metadata. So there are a lot of apps like and plugins that will sort of anonymize these photos for you. So again, we can post some of that information. But here's an example from the Chicago Reader this week actually did sort of anonymize protesters by blurring out their faces in a photo spread this week, which I think maybe the first time a news organization has done that, so pretty radical. Everyone is sort of thinking outside the box this week, which is really great. And just a word about social media accessibility. This is not like meant to be an exhaustive list by any means. We definitely welcome resources if people have them. Other things to think about, share them in the chat, or we can plug them into our the resources we share at the end. But some things to think about: including image descriptions in your posts, so people who are using assistive tech or working with an assistant can access your posts, providing captioning for videos or a transcript, making text readable and clean, and limiting emoji use, which get read out as like text. It can be confusing. Same with hashtags, put those at the end of posts. A lot of platforms have different capabilities. So like Twitter offers alternative text and YouTube offers captioning. So just going into settings and seeing what's possible. Facebook and Instagram both allow you to edit their machine-generated alternative text to make it more accurate, and also not using color to signify meaning like in charts or in graphs or graphics. Just a few things to think about so your post can be accessible to more people. Here are some of our recommendations for trustworthy social media sources. Again, not exhaustive, just like a few recommendations, and it's pretty Chicago centric. I realize there's a lot of people joining us who are not from Chicago, but we encourage you to figure out what's going on here as well. We also wanted to do a little fundraising or encourage people to donate to the Brave Space Alliance and as sort of a virtual tip jar today. So the Brave Space Alliance is the first Black-led, trans-led LGBTQ center. It's on the south side of Chicago. And they're dedicated to creating and providing affirming, culturally competent, forest-biased resources, programming, and services for LGBTQ folks on the south and west side. They're really incredible. They're doing amazing work. These past few weeks, they've been really helpful for protesters and for folks who have been affected by the cancellation of school lunches in Chicago. So definitely a worthwhile organization. Here is the link. Here are a few ways to get in touch and make yourself useful. We have an Instagram. If you haven't followed us already, we'll be posting more information about the workshops there. And I will stop sharing my screen. I think that's all I have. I think it's back to you, Linnea.
So we did want to encourage folks to think about something you can commit to doing this week, and to putting it in the chat as a way of having public accountability. And so to model that, NYU folks will start, I am going to follow up from a conversation with my stepsister who's been talking about defunding the police and wants it to be a reform. And I will follow up and talk about why thinking of it as reform is not acceptable, and she needs to be thinking about this as an abolition move. That's something I will do. Carrie? And then, yeah, I just encourage you all to put those, you're in the chat, your commitments. Cool. Awesome. We were getting some responses, Carrie, to best practices of blurring faces and whatnot?
Mhm.
People are posting some links.
Yeah. Let me, I'm gonna post a few links in the chat right now
Cool.
for some sources. And here's another one. So yeah, these articles sort of yeah, talk a little bit about what some of the plugins are to anonymize the info.
And Monica, just to answer your question, yes, we are going to be sharing out all of the sources that we drew upon for this presentation. Are right now, they will be accessible through, we have like a view only link to the presentation that we are gonna post on our website, and all of our sources are in the notes, and then we're also adding them to the toolkit, which is also going to be posted on the website, and that's even more sources.
I also wanted to just note that the encrypted messaging app Signal now allows you to also blur people's faces, so it's sort of a twofer if you download Signal.
Thank you, everyone, for putting your commitments in the chat. This is a really heartening that we're all going to go from here and do some work. In that vein, we also are starting a text thread. If it would be useful to be on a thread to continue accountability or to ask questions, feel free to put your number in the chat with your name and area code, and you can opt out of that at any time. And we will be sending, we'll be putting the link to the toolkit in the chat, and the slides will be accessible from this workshop in the chat, and then eventually the video will be as well. And you'll be getting a survey from us. We would love to hear your thoughts so that we can improve upon this workshop series for the next couple. Our next session will be Body on the Line with a sign. There will be some sign making, I believe, or tips. So come prepared for that one. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your evening to be with us tonight.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for adding your number for this text chain.
And for all of these incredible commitments.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll contact you later with more info on the text chain. I don't know if we said that, but right.
Yes.
People are still adding. Thank you, thank you.
Before we break?
Say again, Carrie?
Any other questions before we break and give people a little more time to add to the chat if they want?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Do you guys know of like white anti-racism work groups that are in other cities in America?
That would be a great thing for us to start compiling. Where are you located?
Chicago. Hi.
Oh, hello. That's a great thing that we could put out.
Gwyneth, don't you have a recommendation?
Yeah, Baltimore Racial Justice Action is an incredible org based in Baltimore, and they do anti-racist training for everybody. They caucus, where they have different workshops depending on if you're a person with white privilege or if you identify as POC. And they've been starting online courses, so I'm going to put in the chat their website. So even for people who aren't in Baltimore, it's an option.
We had a question about whether this is a white-run organization.
It is not. So it is very much, yeah, it's a diverse group for sure.
Their resources are for everybody, yeah.
I've personally had mixed experiences with Surge, but I know Surge or Standing Up for Racial Justice has chapters all over the country. Some are more accountable than others, I think. But many of them are always partnered with Black or POC-led organizations in the area to make sure that they hold themselves accountable.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I'm also gonna post the resource toolkit in the chat since it seemed to slow down a little bit. So in case you missed it earlier, we really recommend checking this out, what I just posted.
And we will be updating it and adding to it. So it's not, you know, it's not like in its definitive form, but.
I don't really live anywhere in particular, which is complicated, but I feel like something that's got me stuck about where I'm donating to is that people keep saying we should emphasize local, and because I don't know where that is, so I've been trying to like then look at all of the organizations I could donate regularly to, and I don't know how to choose, and I don't know if I should choose a national one that then so anyway, some thoughts on where to donate when you're not located in a place could be helpful.
Megan, I have one for you. Hi. I just came across this one today, but it's it's kind of like an amalgamated fund that's for like all bail funds in the United States. So that could be a good one. Can
you put it in the little, oh, I'm not muted anymore.
Yes, I can put it in the chat. It's also in the resource toolkit, but I'll find it and put it in here for you. Right?
Cool, thank you.
Hi, Megan. I can't find it right now, but I'll send the link in a second. A friend had sent one of all the places in the US that are doing like mutual aid kind of things, real neighborhood based that they're putting together. So maybe pick and choose based on where you have been or communities you've been a part of. I will grab that now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I also, oh, sorry. I was just gonna say, I think that same one has, an Act Blue that you can donate to, and it splits it across organizations.
Great. And can you set that up for a monthly thing? Perfect. Okay, thank you.
There's also a way to like give directly to Black folks in need. So if you want to do that, I know specifically there's at least one Instagrammer that I follow called You're Doing Great, and they share really like a bunch of rad stuff, but every Sunday they post just like calls for donations from Black individuals, and you just like, usually it's like Cash App or PayPal or Venmo. I'm gonna try and type their handle.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a quick question that's like kind of broad. If anyone has resources of like if you're in a position of management in your workplace and your workplace is admittedly mostly white people, how to have these conversations with your coworkers and kind of transform your workplace to be, be allies and accomplices as well.
I know there are at least a few of those resources in the toolkit somewhere. I'm not super familiar with them, so I couldn't say like if they're good or not, but they're there. So I don't know if anybody else had anything.
We will be talking a little bit more about that too in one of our other workshops. I think the one in 2 weeks. I forget what it's called. Maybe
Call your people in.
Yeah. So yeah, we can definitely make it a point to have some info that's workplace focused.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Bridget. I have some experience with that from a previous job and can definitely like make sure that I pull in some of those resources into that third workshop. And I hadn't even thought about that, so I really appreciate you bringing this up because that's really important. Thank you. Also, just saying this, like I'm always down to have conversations with people about things like that, and like, you know, feel free to like message. We check the Make Yourself Useful Instagram a lot, so like feel free to message us on Instagram, and I would say like we may not have the capacity to respond to everything, but for something like that, I would definitely be happy to like have a conversation.
Kate, someone asked if they signed up for this workshop, are they automatically signed up for future workshops?
Listen, I don't know. So there's the thing that we could do though is I think what we'll probably do is figure out some of the technical difficulties that you all witnessed and participated in with us here today. Thank you. And that kind of like patience and you know what we've sort of seen here, and I think we'll like kind of improve on. I think there's potentially a way that we could do that. What we can do is follow up tomorrow and try to figure that out, and maybe like there may be that we have to sign you up ourselves, or we may, you know, like message you and give you guys a little advance notice to sign up for the next ones. I'm not sure how we can do that, but we can try. How about that? We're just gonna try.
Yeah, right now. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
We have all your email addresses, and we have like a record of this, and so, you know, it's we can certainly like sort of try to figure that out. For sure.
We will share video and materials for every workshop publicly, so you don't have to worry about that. Everyone will be able to access that.
Yeah, right now the workshops are set up as like individual signups on Eventbrite, but there might be, like Kate said, there's going to be some tweaking. So even if things are like full on Eventbrite now, we might be able to expand capacity. We might find another way to do this since there were some glitches. So just stay tuned, please.
One thing I added to the chat that I think we can add to our list of Instagram accounts, that as an Instagram that I sort of found recently that has a lot of great resources, is one about like it's called strength-centered speech, and it has a lot of like great tools for like, you know, kind of, you know, maybe decolonizing the way that you're, but like also like adding accessibility to the way that you're sort of posting and talking online. Things like stand up for something, you know, like just some things that are really simple, but I really liked their tools, so we can add that to our list too.
Just to add a note to what Bridget was asking about for resources in terms of how to have these conversations in the workplace, I work within mental health and the employee assistance field, and what I would suggest is speaking with human resources and specifically asking them if your EAP, which is known as your employee assistance program, has any resources that they've sent to your HR team specifically about racial equity, this uprising that's happening. A lot of EAPs, like the one I work for, are churning out information and resources. It's unfortunately sometimes it just stops at HR if they don't push those out to staff members. So they may have something that the EAP has already put out for them, but they just haven't shared it with staff. So I would suggest starting there as well.
Thank you. I think that's definitely helpful information. My case might be a little bit unique. I work for a 4-person nonprofit, 4 employees. So we don't have an HR department, but thank you for everyone sharing some information in the chat as well. And I look forward to the future training that you guys are going to do too. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. My name's Vanessa. I just have a link that I want to share. There's a Black woman-led consulting group for organizational work around anti-racism. And she's having a free workshop on June 11th called Whiteness at Work. So I'm just going to post that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This is Monica. I have 2 questions. Can you guys hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you for this. This was great. I think one question I have will be simple for you to answer, and one might be a little bit harder. So the first one is I had never actually heard of NYU until this. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about, I know you're a collective. Is this your work? Is this separate from what you do from work? That's just kind of on my mind a little bit. And then at the beginning, when we were talking about like some premises, I know that one thing we talked about, which I am fully behind, is like looking to Black voices and Black leadership. And then there was also also standing for prison abolition rather than reform. And then we watched a video with Brittany Pecknett, who runs Campaign Zero and who came up with the 8 Can't Wait campaign. And so like that's like a tension that I've just been like kind of navigating and feeling. And I didn't know if other people could like speak to that, or just kind of, yeah, it feels like in conflict. And I love DeRay McKesson, and I love Brittany Pecknett, and I love Pot Save the People, and I look to them a lot. And so I'm just really, that's something that like I'm sitting with a lot this week.
Yeah, I could speak to the second part. I don't know if anyone else wants to also jump in, but I think that's a really great point. I think, I think that you can like some parts of a person's politics and not others. I think, it's important to realize that like, we all have like sort of beliefs and political standpoints on a spectrum. Obviously Brittany is like super smart and, like was one of like the first people in the Black Lives Matter, universe to really kind of become a public voice. And also like the 8 Can't Wait campaign can be terrible. So, I think that's just like a reality. That's kind of the way that I look at it. And I don't know if someone else has anything else to say or wants to talk about Make Yourself Useful.
I can just jump, this is Ruby, I can jump in and yeah, Carrie, I totally agree. And I think your question made me think about those like anonymous infographics that we posted about like clarifying your own position. And I think so much of this work is actually about that. And it's about like really taking the time to study. We're in a really amazing, unprecedented time where we have access to loads of information on the internet, but none of it is a replacement for like reading books, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how much time you have and what you like to do. But I think like digging deeper and looking at the history of Black power in this country is a really good way to kind of like soothe and give yourself more space to hold those tensions. And in terms of the history of Make Yourself Useful, it's not like a paid collective. It's very grassroots. It's not a nonprofit. We've shifted and morphed a lot over the past, I would say, I think it started in like 2014. And it started out as like satellite study to action groups throughout the city of Chicago. And then it slowly became more of like a public facing educational, like popular education collective. And yeah, we've done a lot of different kinds of work. This year we've done a lot of fundraising and yeah, public facing educational events. We've also had a partnership with Let Us Breathe Collective, which is like a space for Black liberation on the South Side, and had like a year and a half of doing like physical kinds of like maintenance work with them or for them. Yeah, we keep shifting and we're very open.
Thank you for sharing all that. That's super helpful. I really appreciate it, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Thank you.
I just posted a link to our website in the chat, and you can see various projects we've worked on there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gwyneth.
So we want to respect people's time. It's coming up on 9:30 Central Time, many other times in other time zones. Thank you so much for coming this evening. I hope that you feel you're leaving here with some ideas of what you want to take moving forward. And I hope you have a lovely evening and that you have a delicious breakfast in the morning.